The rich men in the tailored suits didn't even step out of the auction tent to look at it. They stood under the canvas, holding their warm coffees, looking out at the freezing rain, and laughed. A low, rumbling, collective laugh of men who had millions of dollars in the bank and didn't have time for garbage. It was Lot 42, listed on the auction manifest as a defective 1960s industrial generator block. It sat in the mud at the edge of the Blackwood scrapyard, a massive, unrecognizable cube of seized iron packed with 4 decades of grease, rust, and neglect. The auctioneer, a man who got paid a percentage of high-dollar sales, didn't even want to bother with it. He pointed his gavel at the rusted cube, chuckled into the microphone, and asked if anyone would give him $50 just so they didn't have to pay a crew to haul it to the smelter. No one moved, no one spoke, until a quiet, shaking voice from the back of the tent said, 45. The crowd turned, and the laughter that followed was supposed to be the end of the story. It was supposed to put a homeless 17-year-old boy back in his place. But there was one thing the rich men in the suits didn't see when they looked at that rusted block. One thing they didn't bother to check. One detail hidden beneath half an inch of industrial sludge that was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about wealth, power, and the things we throw away. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes. Before we go any further, this needs to be said. If you have ever been laughed out of a room by people who thought they were better than you, if you have ever been looked at like you were nothing more than a problem to be swept away, this story is not just about a piece of scrap metal. It is about what happens when the people who are supposed to know everything miss the one thing that changes absolutely everything. Subscribe. This channel is for the people who look closer than everyone else. And drop a comment right now. Has someone ever written you off before they knew what you were truly capable of? I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning. His name was Leo, and he didn't have a home. For the past 2 years, Leo had been living in the rusted-out shell of a 1982 transit van parked just beyond the chain-link fence of the Blackwood scrapyard. It was a brutal existence. The kind of life that ages a boy 10 years for every winter he survives. He didn't have a safety net. He didn't have parents calling to check on him. He had the dirt, the cold, and the scrap. He survived by scavenging. Every morning, before the massive heavy machinery woke up and the crushers started roaring, Leo would walk the perimeter of the yard. He was looking for scraps the big machines missed. A stripped copper wire here, a discarded aluminum fitting there. He would collect them in a bucket, clean them with freezing water, and sell them for pennies just to buy enough food to make it to the next day. The yard was owned by a man named Thomas Vance. Vance was everything Leo was not. He wore expensive leather boots that he never got muddy. He smoked imported cigars and drove a truck that cost more than the entire neighborhood Leo grew up in. Vance was a man who measured the world strictly in tons of steel and profit margins, and he absolutely despised Leo. To Vance, the homeless boy was just a rat picking at the edges of his empire. When Leo would bring his bucket of copper to the weighing scale, Vance wouldn't even look him in the eye. He would intentionally underweigh the scrap, toss a few crumpled dollar bills into the mud, and watch with a smirk as the boy had to drop to his knees in the dirt to pick them up. It was a power play, a daily reminder of who mattered and who didn't. Leo never fought back. He couldn't afford to. He just picked up his wet dollars, swallowed his pride, and went back to his frozen van. Every November, Vance hosted an elite industrial auction right there in the middle of the scrapyard. It was a massive event. Buyers from 3 states over would drive in with flatbed trailers to bid on decommissioned heavy machinery. Bulldozers, cranes, commercial engines. Millions of dollars changed hands in a single afternoon. Leo was never allowed near the tent. He usually watched from a distance, hidden behind a stack of crushed cars, listening to the auctioneer's fast-paced chant. But this year, something was different. This year, Leo had been watching a specific piece of scrap for 3 weeks, Lot 42. It had been dumped out of the back of a freight train car that Vance had purchased for scrap. It looked like a generator block from a very old, very large ship. It was nearly perfectly square, incredibly heavy, and completely sealed in a thick crust of hardened oil and deep, pitted rust. Vance's mechanics had tried to crack it open to strip the internal copper, but whatever bolts held it together were rusted solid. They hit it with sledgehammers. They tried a torch. Nothing worked. Frustrated, Vance ordered them to just drag it to the auction pile. Let some other idiot deal with it, he had said. But Leo had noticed something. While the mechanics were hitting it with sledgehammers, a small chip of the outer crust had flaked off near the bottom corner. And underneath that rust, there wasn't cast iron. There was a dull, yellowish gleam. Brass. Industrial generators weren't wrapped in thick brass plates. The metal was too soft, too expensive. Leo didn't know what it was, but his survival instincts, honed by 2 years of picking through other people's garbage, told him it wasn't a generator. On the day of the auction, the freezing rain was coming down hard. The rich buyers stood shoulder to shoulder under the heated tent. Lot 42 was the last item on the manifest. The auctioneer sighed as he looked out at the rusted cube sitting in the downpour. "All right, gentlemen," the auctioneer said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Lot 42, defective block. It's heavy, it's ugly, and I don't want to look at it anymore." "Do I hear $100? Silence. The buyers drank their coffee. Vance leaned against the podium, puffing his cigar, looking annoyed. $50, the auctioneer pleaded. "Come on, boys, scrap weight alone covers that. Give me 50. More silence. Vance laughed and took the microphone. "I'll pay someone $50 just to drag it out of my sight," he joked. The crowd chuckled. Then from the very back of the tent, standing in the pouring rain, soaking wet and shivering, Leo raised a grease-stained hand. In his palm, he held a tightly rolled wad of $1 and $5 bills, every single cent he had to his name. "45, Leo said. His voice cracked, but it was loud enough to be heard over the rain. The entire tent turned around. For a second, there was just absolute silence. And then the laughter started. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a cruel, mocking roar. The rich buyers pointed at the soaked, shivering boy holding his dirty money. Vance's face turned red, but then he smiled. A vicious, ugly smile. He grabbed the microphone again. "Well, look at this," Vance boomed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The yard rat wants to play with the big boys. Sold to the homeless kid for his life savings." The hammer slammed down. The crowd erupted into applause and whistles. Leo walked up to the clerk, placed his 45 wet dollars on the table, and walked out into the rain toward his block. He didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at the laughing men. He just put his hands on the freezing iron and began the long, agonizing process of dragging it through the mud toward his van. It took him 3 hours to move it 100 yards. By the time he got it inside the back of his rusted van, it was pitch black outside. His hands were bleeding. His muscles were screaming. He was completely broke, and he was starving. He sat on the floor of the van, illuminating the dark space with a single battery-powered flashlight. He looked at the massive, ugly cube. For a brief second, doubt crept in. Maybe Vance was right. Maybe he was just a rat who had spent his only money on a useless piece of garbage. But Leo shook his head. He pulled a stiff wire brush from his toolbox. He positioned the flashlight, sat cross-legged on the floor, and started to scrub. He scrubbed for an hour. The sound of the wire bristles tearing against the hardened grease was the only sound in the van. Slowly, painfully, the thick black sludge began to give way. The small patch of brass he had seen earlier began to expand. It wasn't just a patch. It was a massive, thick plate bolted into the steel frame. He poured a little bit of precious drinking water over the metal to wash away the dust and kept scrubbing. 2 hours passed. His fingers went numb. But then, under the harsh light of the flashlight, letters began to appear, engraved deeply into the brass. Leo wiped the sweat from his forehead and leaned in closer. He traced the engraved letters with his bleeding fingers. It read, Department of the Treasury, Transport Vault, serial number 804, 1964. Leo stopped breathing. His heart slammed against his ribs. It wasn't a generator. It was a transit safe. In the 1960s, the government used heavily disguised, armored drop safes to transport high-value assets by rail. They were designed to look like heavy industrial equipment so train robbers wouldn't look twice at them. And it was incredibly heavy. He felt around the edges of the brass plate. There was no keyhole. But there was a heavy, concealed latch mechanism buried under a thick weld of rust. Leo grabbed his heavy iron crowbar. He wedged the flat edge into the seam of the latch. He braced his boots against the side of the van and pulled with everything he had. The metal groaned. It fought back. Decades of rust held it tight, but Leo had something the rust didn't. He had desperation. He pulled harder, his vision blurring, until a loud, violent crack echoed in the small van. The latch broke free. The heavy steel door swung open on stiff hinges. Leo shined the flashlight inside. He expected to see empty space, maybe some old documents. What he saw made him drop the flashlight. The interior of the vault was completely weather-sealed, and stacked neatly inside, wrapped in protective wax paper that had barely yellowed with age, were bundles of paper, but they weren't normal documents. Leo reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the bundles. He peeled back the wax paper. Staring back at him was the pristine, uncirculated face of a 1964 United States gold certificate. And there wasn't just one bundle. There were dozens of them. The next morning, the rain had stopped. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled through the gates of the Blackwood scrapyard. Thomas Vance stepped out of his office, frowning. People who drove cars like that didn't come to his yard. A man in a tailored suit carrying a metal briefcase stepped out of the car. Vance approached him, putting on a fake smile. "Can I help you, sir? Looking for some vintage iron?" Vance asked. The man adjusted his glasses and looked at Vance coldly. "No," the man said. "I'm looking for a Mr. Leo. I was told he resides near the perimeter." Vance's jaw dropped. "The rat! You're looking for the homeless kid. For what?" The man didn't answer. He just walked past Vance, stepping carefully through the mud, heading straight for Leo's rusted van. Vance followed, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. Something was wrong. When they reached the van, the back doors were open. Leo was sitting on an overturned bucket, drinking a cheap cup of coffee. The massive, open vault was sitting next to him. The man in the suit walked up, introduced himself as an independent appraiser for high-yield historical assets, and knelt beside the vault. He put on a pair of white cotton gloves, reached inside, and pulled out one of the bundles. He inspected the certificate under a jeweler's loupe. For a full minute there was no sound except the distant roar of the crushers. Then the appraiser looked up at Leo. His face was pale. "Son," the appraiser whispered, "these are uncirculated treasury notes. They are flawless, at auction to a private collector. This vault contains roughly $2.4 million. Vance choked. He stumbled backward, his shiny boots sinking deep into the mud. His face turned the color of ash. $2.4 million in his yard, under his nose, and he had sold it for $45. Vance scrambled forward, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, sweaty desperation. "Wait, wait," Vance yelled, holding up his hands. "Leo, buddy, there was a mistake in the auction manifest. That wasn't supposed to be sold. It's company property. I'll give you $50,000 right now. Cash, just walk away." Leo looked at the man who had tormented him for years, the man who had made him pick crumpled dollars out of the mud. Leo took a slow sip of his coffee. He stood up. "The hammer dropped, Mr. Vance," Leo said softly. "It's a legal sale. You said it yourself." Vance was hyperventilating now. $100,000, $500,000, Leo, please." Leo didn't even blink. He zipped up his worn canvas jacket, picked up the metal briefcase the appraiser had brought to secure the assets, and walked toward the black luxury sedan. He stopped right before he got in, looked back at Vance, who was now literally on his knees in the mud of his own junkyard, and smiled. "Keep your crumpled dollars, Mr. Vance," Leo said. He got into the back seat of the sedan, and the car drove away, leaving Thomas Vance kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by his worthless rusted iron. The thing about old, rusted machines is the same thing that is true about people. You cannot know the value of something just by looking at the surface. You cannot assess the depth of someone's worth by standing at a distance and making a snap judgment. The people who look at the rust and only see garbage will always lose to the people who are willing to scrub a little harder to find the gold underneath. If this story hit you somewhere you weren't expecting, if you found yourself thinking about a time when someone looked at you and only saw what you didn't have instead of what you were capable of becoming, then you already know why this channel exists. We are not here for the easy stories. We are not here for the shiny new machines or the people who had everything handed to them. We are here for the moments when something that looked finished turned out to be just beginning. There are more stories like this one, a lot more, and every single one of them has a moment, one detail, one question that somebody almost missed that changes everything. Subscribe right now, because the next story is already in the works, and it starts with a seized-up mining excavator that 3 separate mechanics said would never run again, and a locked steel compartment hidden under the floorboards that no one can quite explain. Drop a comment below this video. Tell me what you almost gave up on that turned out to be your greatest asset. Your business, your passion, yourself. I want to know. The community here reads these, and sometimes the best stories in the comments become the next video. You belong here. Don't go anywhere.